This is The Truth for Today. I am Michael Boldea, your host, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you to today's program. Today, we will be concluding a two-part series entitled Victory and Defeat, which focuses on one of the greatest military victories Israel ever obtained, and they obtained it not by their strength, not by their might or military strategy, but rather by faith and obedience to the voice and the guidance of God. It also focuses on one of the most shameful defeats that Israel ever endured at the hands of a small city, an insignificant city named Ai. From a logical standpoint, the city of Ai should have been an easy conquest for Israel. It should have been readily overtaken and sacked, but something happened. Something happened wherein a handful of men put to flight the warriors of Israel. But I get ahead of myself. As has become customary on this program, we will first dispense with our scripture verse of the day as well as our quote of the day. And after these tasks are completed, we will segue into today's teaching. And today we will be talking about why Israel suffered defeat at Ai, and why we as believers and followers of Christ sometimes suffer defeats of our own. Now, perhaps it's just me, but there are occasions and there are circumstances wherein something that seemed small and insignificant, something I thought I could readily overlook, ignore, or overcome on my own, becomes a very large issue, one that seems overwhelming even. Now, whenever such occasions or circumstances arise, I find that the reason they seemed so overwhelming is because I trusted in myself. I was trusting in my own strength. I was trusting in my own ingenuity and not in the power of God. Now, victory over such circumstances is only a humble and obedient heart away. Throughout the years, I've learned that whenever I try to go out on my own, whenever I try to do something in and of my own strength, it turns out to be an abject failure. When I trust in God, however, even the impossible is made possible. And it is done in such a way that God gets all the glory. God gets all the praise. All right, I started preaching, and we haven't even gotten to our scripture verse of the day. So our scripture verse of the day comes from Proverbs 21, verse 2. Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. Now, it's not whether or not our way is right in our own eyes. It's not whether or not our conduct is right in our own eyes. It's not whether or not our speech is right in our own eyes, because let's face it, we're not unbiased when it comes to ourselves. In fact, when it concerns the self, we are perhaps the most biased individuals in the world. We find justifications for things that cannot be justified. We find excuses for the inexcusable because we tend to gravitate towards protecting and defending the self. The only problem with this mindset, however, is that God knows the truth. God knows our hearts. And it is by His standard and by His word that we will be judged and that He will judge the world. The thing of paramount importance is that our ways, our conduct, our speech, and our hearts be right in God's eyes and not our own. For it is He who weighs the heart. Now, our quote of the day comes from J.C. Riley's book entitled The Gospel of Luke, which in effect is a collection of commentaries on the entire Gospel of Luke, and it includes some truly fascinating expository thoughts. Now, today's quote is a bit longer than what you may have become accustomed to on this program, but I believe that it is vital, and I believe that it is worth sharing with you. Humility may well be called the queen of the Christian graces. To know our own sinfulness and weakness and to feel our need for Christ is the very beginning of saving religion. Humility is a grace which has always been the distinguishing feature in the character of the holiest saints in every generation. Abraham and Moses and Job and David and Daniel and Paul were all eminently humble men. Humility is a grace within the reach of every true Christian. Would we know the root and spring of humility? One word describes it. The root of humility is right knowledge. The man who really knows himself and his own heart, God and his infinite majesty and holiness, Christ and the price at which he was redeemed, that man will never be a proud man. He will count himself like Jacob, unworthy of the least of all of God's mercies. He will say to himself like Job, I am vile. He will cry like Paul, I am chief of sinners. Ignorance, nothing but sheer ignorance. Ignorance of self, ignorance of God, of Christ, is the real secret of pride. From that miserable self-ignorance, may we daily pray to be delivered. He is the wise man who knows himself, and he who knows himself will find nothing within to make him proud. And that was our extended quote of the day. Now, I decided to include it in today's broadcast because it speaks to the heart of man, but also infers some glorious truths. If we remain humble, we will not walk in our own strength, but in his strength. If we remain humble, we will not trust in our own wisdom, but in his wisdom. If we remain humble, we will not appropriate any glory for ourselves, but rightly give it all to him. Now, since we've already covered the victory portion in the first of this two-part series, today we will be focusing on the defeat of Israel. Now, I realize nobody wants to talk about defeat. It is a downer. It's depressing, it's disconcerting, but it is a reality in the lives of so many believers today. As Thomas S. Monson, a bishop in the early 1900s, so aptly put it, the past is behind us. Learn from it. The future is ahead. Prepare for it. The present is here. Live it. Now, we speak of Israel's victory and defeat so we can learn. We need to learn what they did to obtain their victory, what they did to ensure their defeat, and by learning, keep ourselves from making the self-same mistakes. As a backdrop to today's teaching, we will be using Joshua chapter 7. And although we do not have the time to read the entire passage, we will be pointing out some key verses. Now, Israel had obtained the victory. The walls of Jericho had come crashing down. And it was not due to any force that they were able to muster. The walls of Jericho fell because they had faith in the God who had brought them thus far, and they obeyed his direction. Now, upon their entry into the city, the people were given specific instructions yet again. The first was to destroy the city and all who were in it, sparing only Rahab the harlot and all who were in her house. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't spend a little while talking about this woman, Rahab. What made her so special? Why was she the only one that God had commanded Israel to spare when they sacked Jericho? Rahab was a woman who lived in a city that God had slated for judgment. She was a woman who lived in the midst of an unfaithful people, a woman who herself was fallen from a moral standpoint. In fact, the Bible tells us that Rahab was a harlot, or a prostitute. It was this woman's house that the two spies Joshua had sent to reconnoiter Jericho lodged in. News spread throughout Jericho that these two men were at Rahab's house, and the king sent soldiers to her home.